I jolted awake to a scream that sliced through the morning stillness. Not the usual grumbles about barking dogs or clattering garbage trucks, but a raw, gut-wrenching wail that snapped me upright, adrenaline surging. Rubbing sleep from my eyes, I wondered if I dreamed it, but then it came again, sharp and real, followed by the low hum of voices outside. Something was wrong. Half-dazed, I grabbed my phone and stumbled to the window, yanking the blinds aside, and froze. My house, my sleek, modern gray sanctuary, was no longer gray. Overnight, it had morphed into a blinding, neon pink monstrosity, the kind of color that seared your retinas, stolen straight from a toy store's discount bin. For a moment, I just gaped, brains scrambling to catch up. My house had been vandalized, but why and by who? Then I saw her. Karen, the HOA's self-anointed queen, stood smugly on my driveway, beige capris pristine, oversized sunglasses perched like a crown, arms crossed as she surveyed her handiwork with a smirk. Two painters flanked her, tools in hand, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Rage twisted my gut as I stormed downstairs, flung the door open, and marched straight at her. "Karen, what the hell is this?" I demanded, flailing at the radioactive nightmare that was now my home. She turned, her smile syrupy and fake. "Good morning, do you like it? We decided your house needed a little enhancement." I blinked, fury mounting. "Who? We? And what gives you the right to paint my house without permission?" She scoffed, as if I were the unreasonable one. "The HOA, of course. That dull gray was an eyesore, so depressing. We needed vibrancy, and as acting president, I have authority to enforce aesthetic improvements." My fists clenched, nails biting into my palms. "Karen, this is vandalism. You can't just repaint my house whatever color you want." She arched an eyebrow, reveling in it. "Oh, but I can. It's in the bylaws, Section 4, Clause 7. The HOA ensures homes meet the approved aesthetic, and I've declared pink the new standard." My jaw tightened. It was nonsense, a rule twisted beyond reason. "That doesn't mean you can do this without consent." She waved me off. "It's done now. Be grateful, boost your property value. Everyone loves a pop of color." I spun to the painters, barely containing myself. "Did she pay you for this?" One nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, she said it was an official HOA project. We just followed orders." Karen clapped gleefully. "And they did wonderfully. The street, so much livelier now." I glanced around, neighbors clustered on their lawns, whispering, some horrified, others amused, none backing Karen's madness. It should have been a comfort, but my house was still pink, and she stood there like she'd bestowed a gift. I took a deep breath, forcing calm. "You're paying to repaint this, Karen. I never approved it. I want it back how it was." She laughed, sharp and cruel. "Oh, that's not happening. It's part of the HOA's initiative. If you want it changed, submit a request, pay a fine for violating standards, and wait for board approval, which I won't give." My blood boiled, but I refused to crack. "We'll see about that," I said, voice steel. Her smirk flickered, then steadied. "Oh, I know we will. Enjoy your new look. I've got a meeting." She sashayed off, leaving me in my driveway, fists balled, neighbors gawking. This wasn't just about paint. It was Karen's power trip, her belief she could rule unchecked. But she didn't know my secret. I owned the HOA, and she'd just lit the fuse to her own downfall. I stood there staring at my neon pink house as Karen's retreating figure vanished down the street, her smugness lingering like a bad smell. The audacity of it, painting my home without a shred of consent, then acting like she'd done me a favor, burned hotter with every passing second. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a declaration of war, her crown as HOA tyrant gleaming in the morning sun. But she had no clue who she was dealing with. Years ago, when the original president moved out, I'd quietly bought up the majority of the HOA shares. Pure convenience then, letting Karen play queen because I couldn't be bothered to care. Now she'd made it personal, and as I watched neighbors murmur and point, an idea sparked. She thought she ran this place, but I held the real power, and it was time to use it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the HOA secretary's number, and called an emergency meeting for that night. Karen wouldn't see it coming. Then I turned to the gawking crowd. "Everyone, clubhouse tonight. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." Curious glances flickered, but most nodded. They'd suffered under her reign too long to miss a chance at change. I stormed back inside, the pink glow taunting me through the windows, and spent the day packing, plotting. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about her years of petty tyranny, fines for grass length, mailbox colors, chalk drawings. She thought she'd won with this stunt, but she'd painted a target on her own back, and I was ready to fire. By evening, the clubhouse buzzed with anticipation as neighbors trickled in. Some excited, others skeptical, all weary of Corinne's rule. I arrived early, setting up in her so-called throne room, rows of chairs facing the stage where she'd barked orders for years. Tonight, that stage was mine. The tension thickened as people filled the seats, whispers bouncing off the walls until Corinne strutted in, clipboard in hand, superiority dripping from her like cheap perfume. She barely spared me a glance, tapping her manicured nails. All right, everyone, let's get this over with. I assume we're here to discuss the recent aesthetic improvements. I stepped forward, meeting her gaze with a grin. Oh, we're definitely talking about the pink house, Corinne, but also something bigger. Her eyes narrowed. I don't have time for your nonsense. If you're whining about the color, save it. It's final. I chuckled, shaking my head. Actually, you should listen because you don't know I own the HOA. The room went dead silent, gasps, confused stares, a few sitting up straighter. Corinne scoffed, rolling her eyes. That's ridiculous. You don't own the HOA. I run it. I slid a folder from my bag, placing it on the table. No, you've been acting like you run it. I bought the majority shares years ago. You've just been enforcing rules without knowing who really holds the power. Her confidence wavered as she snatched the folder, flipping through pages, panic creeping into her eyes. This can't be right, she stammered. I leaned in, voice low. Oh, it's very right, and now I'm taking control. Time for some changes. Murmurs erupted, excitement, disbelief, as Corinne gripped the papers like they might combust. I faced the crowd. First order, the new community-wide house color is pink. Since Corinne loves it, every house should match mine. Gasps turned to laughter, a few claps ringing out as her face twisted in horror. You can't do that, she shrieked. I tilted my head. Why not? You said enforcing aesthetics is HOA power. I'm just following your lead. The room roared, neighbors gleeful at the turnaround. Corinne slammed her clipboard down. This is outrageous. I demand we revoke your authority. I raised a hand. Oh, I'm not done. Second order, monthly community votes to repaint your house any color we choose. Cheers exploded. Lime green, electric blue, zebra stripes shouted out, as Corinne's reign began to crumble under her own rules. The clubhouse erupted as my words sank in. Neighbors cheered, some shouting wild color ideas for Corinne's house, others laughing so hard they clutched their sides, the air thick with a joy that had been stifled for years under her reign. Corinne stood frozen, her clipboard trembling in her hands, her face a mask of disbelief twisting into fury as the crowd turned her own game against her. You're making a mockery of the HOA? She screeched, voice shrill enough to crack glass. I grinned, calm as ever. Oh, I'm just ensuring everyone has a say. Isn't that what a good HOA should do? She shook her head violently. This is harassment. You can't turn my house into a joke. I shrugged. Didn't seem like a problem when you did it to mine. Her eyes blazed, but the crowd wasn't hers anymore. They laughed, nodded, fully on board. Years of her bullying flipped into their triumph. She spun to the room, desperation clawing at her voice. You can't let him do this. It's madness. But no one listened. They were too busy reveling in the shift, her pleas drowned by chuckles and color suggestions. I stepped closer, voice steady. Corinne, you've made our lives miserable for years, painting my house without permission, fining people for nothing, bullying us into your rules. That ends today. She trembled, barely upright, her control slipping through her fingers like sand. I pulled one last document from my bag. And finally, effective immediately, HOA membership is voluntary. No more forced fees, no fines, no more you dictating our lives. The cheers hit a new peak, deafening. People stood, clapped, high-fived. A wave of relief crashing over the room as Corinne's empire crumbled. For a moment, I thought she'd explode, her face flushed, hands shaking. But then her shoulders slumped, defeat settling in. She grabbed her clipboard, muttered something venomous under her breath, and stormed out, the door slamming behind her like a gunshot. The celebration ignited, neighbors hugged, laughed, shook their heads at the absurdity of it all, free at last from her tyranny. As they filed out, I caught snippets. Color votes for Corinne's house, shock at my ownership, relief at no more notices. It wasn't just about my pink house anymore. It was their victory, a weight lifted, and I'd handed them the key. But I knew Corinne. She wouldn't slink away quietly, not with that fire in her eyes, and I braced for her next move. The next morning it came. A sharp knock rattled my door as I sipped coffee, and there she was, disheveled, dark circles framing her eyes, clutching a thick folder like a lifeline. I leaned against the frame, casual. Morning, Corinne, to what do I owe the pleasure? Her glare could have melted steel. This isn't over. I smirked. Oh, but it is, you saw the paperwork, heard the votes, the HOA's mine now. She shoved the folder at me. These are legal complaints. I've contacted a lawyer. You can't change everything overnight. There are procedures. I held up a hand. I know the rules better than you, Karen. You should have read the fine print before throwing your weight around. My changes are legal. Take it to court if you want, but every rule you bent comes back to bite you. Her face reddened, but she pressed on. You think you're clever, humiliating me like this? I tilted my head. You painted my house pink without consent. You humiliated yourself. She huffed, furious. Fine, you want to play dirty? Two can play that game. She spun and stomped off, a threat hanging in the air, but I wasn't fazed. She was desperate, reckless, and that's where she'd slip. Karen's parting words echoed as she stormed off, a hollow threat from a cornered animal, but I knew she'd try something. Her pride wouldn't let her bow out quietly. I spent the day waiting, half expecting a lawyer's letter or some petty HOA loophole flung my way, sipping coffee and staring at my still pink house, now a bizarre badge of defiance. By afternoon, texts from neighbors lit up my phone. Karen had gone door to door, spinning tailies of my illegal coup, warning that without her iron rules, property values would crash, the neighborhood descending into chaos. She was flailing, grasping at straws, but no one bought it. The people she'd fined for years, harassed over trivialities, weren't rushing to her defense. They'd tasted freedom, and her pleas fell flat. I smirked as the messages rolled in. She's losing it, told her to shove it. Can't believe she's still trying. Her desperation was almost pitiful. Then she overplayed her hand. Evening brought shouts outside, and I stepped onto my porch to see Karen in the street, arms flailing, yelling at a growing crowd. You're all being fooled. He's manipulating you. He doesn't care about this community, just revenge. A neighbor fired back. Revenge for what, Karen? You painted his house without permission. Her face twisted. It was for the neighborhood. Good. Another voice cut in. Now we decide what's good, and we say no more Karen rules. Laughter rippled through the group, and I saw it hit her, the realization that her power was gone, her fear tactics useless. She'd ruled through obedience, but now she was a punchline. Her eyes locked on mine, venomous. This isn't over. I gave her a slow smile. I think it is. Defeated, she stormed off, no fight left in her strut, her last stand crumbling under the weight of her own absurdity. Later, I sat on my porch, stars blinking overhead, the pink glow of my house less maddening now, more a trophy of this bizarre victory. A neighbor texted a mock-up of Karen's house in rainbow stripes, captioned, "Voting starts tomorrow," and I laughed. Her reign was dead, but the payback was just beginning. The next morning, the street buzzed with a new energy, an invisible shackle snapped. Bikes littered driveways, lawn chairs sprouted, decorations once banned now flaunted freely. For years, Karen's fines had kept us in line. Now we reveled in the chaos she'd dread. The first community vote loomed that evening, and the excitement crackled. Highlighter yellow, bright orange, even glitter paint tossed around as gleeful revenge. I took a walk, soaking it in. Neighbors waved, some thanking me for toppling her, their fear replaced by a shared triumph that turned strangers into allies. Karen, meanwhile, barricaded herself inside, curtains twitching as she glared at the relaxed world she'd lost. Then came her final gasp. Frank, an older neighbor, stopped by, chuckling. She called me raving about illegal rules, saying property values'll tank, crime'll soar, pure panic. He'd laughed her off, but it showed she wasn't done grasping. I shrugged. She's outnumbered now, let her try. That night, the clubhouse overflowed with voters, chatter buzzing as they swapped ridiculous color ideas for Karen's house. A camaraderie forged in her downfall. I stepped up, unfolding the results. Rainbow stripes. The cheers shook the walls, claps, high fives, pure glee at the poetic justice. Karen, who'd forced beige conformity, would wake to a candy-coated nightmare. As I watched the crowd, I knew this wasn't just about paint. It was about reclaiming our homes, our lives, from her grip. She'd ruled through fear, but we'd turned it into laughter, and that was a win she couldn't undo. The next morning, the paint crew rolled in at dawn, their truck rumbling past my still pink house as I sipped coffee on the porch, waiting for the show. Karen's screech hit before the first brushstroke landed. You can't do this. It's harassment. She burst from her beige fortress, arms flailing at the unfazed workers who calmly began slathering her house in red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, vibrant stripes that turned her pristine domain into a candy-coated fever dream. I strolled over, hands in pockets, grinning, mourning Karen. She whipped around, eyes blazing. You did this, it's illegal, you're violating. I cut her off, flashing my phone with the vote results. Not illegal, community approved per your own rules. Her face flushed a deep crimson, clashing gloriously with the paint. This is vandalism, I'll sue you all, a painter chuckled. Not vandalism, official HOA project. She let out a strangled growl, teetering on the edge of meltdown. I tilted my head. If you want it repainted, just file a request with the HOA. You know how long that takes, right? Her fists balled, body quaking. She was trapped in her own bureaucratic web, and the crowd gathering around us laughed openly, snapping photos of the spectacle. She humiliated others for years. Now the tables had flipped, and she couldn't dodge the spotlight. The last strokes went on, completing the rainbow masterpiece, and she stomped back inside, slamming the door so hard I half expected the frame to crack. Cheers erupted, neighbors clapped. Some set up lawn chairs to watch, drinks in hand, celebrating the end of her tyranny. I stood there, soaking it in. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about us taking back control, refusing to be bullied, and damn, it felt good. She didn't emerge for the rest of the day, her rainbow-striped house a glaring monument to her defeat, while the neighborhood buzzed with life. Kids raced bikes, decorations sprouted, freedom tangible in the air. But I knew Karen. Her silence wasn't surrender, just a pause to regroup. The next morning, I woke refreshed, no longer dreading HOA notices, the pink glow of my own house now a quirky victory symbol. Stepping outside, I froze. A moving truck sat parked at Karen's curb, movers hauling boxes from her porch. I edged closer, watching as she stood there, arms crossed, face a mix of fury and exhaustion, no smugness left, just a woman beaten. Neighbors whispered nearby, some skeptical, others relieved, all curious if this was real or another ploy. I took a sip of coffee, waiting, and her eyes finally met mine, empty of fight, just raw silence. "You're really leaving?" I asked, voice casual. She exhaled, bitter. "No choice. Nobody wants a house that changes color every month. Offers were way below what I paid." I nodded, mock sympathy. "Rough. Guess enforcing all those HOA rules didn't help property values, huh?" Her jaw tightened, but she bit back whatever retort brewed. "You think you're funny," she muttered. I shrugged. "I think I can enjoy my home without someone dictating my fence color, so yeah, pretty funny." She glanced at the movers, then back at me, a flicker of regret, or maybe just loss in her eyes. "I spent years building this HOA into something respectable," she said, slow and heavy, "and you ruined it in one night." I raised an eyebrow. "Respectable? Karen, you find people for welcome mats, forced driveway replacements over cracks. You didn't build respect, you built control." Her lips thinned, but she didn't argue. Maybe she knew it was true, or maybe she just had nothing left. The truck rumbled and she turned away, her rein packed into boxes, ready to roll out. Karen's voice lingered as she turned from me, her bitter words swallowed by the hum of the moving truck, its engine growling as movers hefted the last of her life into its belly. A man in a suit stepped from a car, folder in hand, approaching her with a clipped, "Mrs. Jensen?" She sighed, arms still crossed. "Yeah, that's me. What do you want?" He flipped through papers. "I represent an investment company interested in properties here. We're offering full-price cash if you accept immediately, time-sensitive deal." Her eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief breaking her scowl. "Full price?" He nodded, and she hesitated only a heartbeat before snatching the pen, signing without a glance. I watched, coffee cooling in my hand, a twinge of suspicion at the convenience, but said nothing. She faced me one last time, venom softened by exhaustion. "Enjoy your circus. This neighborhood'll fall apart without real leadership." I smiled. "I think we'll manage." She didn't reply, just trudged inside, and an hour later the truck pulled away, taking her with it. The street exhaled as she vanished. Neighbors spilled out, grins spreading, relief palpable in their waves and nods. Someone cracked a champagne bottle, toasting the end of the Karen era, and laughter rippled through the crowd. I leaned on my porch railing, watching the celebration spark. Bikes cluttered driveways, lawn chairs sprouted, a freedom she'd smothered now blooming wild. For years, she'd nitpicked us into submission, fines for cracks, bans on color, rules for rules' sake. But now her rainbow-striped house stood as a middle finger to her reign, a joke she'd never lived down. The HOA was mine, membership voluntary, and the neighborhood felt alive, unshackled, a weight lifted I hadn't realized we'd all carried. Her exit wasn't just a win, it was a rebirth, and I'd sparked it with her own arrogance. That night I sank into a chair under the stars, my pink house glowing like a warped trophy, and my phone buzzed, an unknown number. "You won this round, but don't think I've forgotten. I'll be back." I chuckled, classic Karen, clinging to spite even in defeat. I typed back, looking forward to it, and tossed the phone aside, savoring the quiet. She could threaten all she wanted. She'd lost the war, and we'd won the peace. The next morning, the buzz held. People lounged outside, unafraid of notices, decorations popping up like defiant flags. The vote's aftermath lingered. Karen's house a striped spectacle, photos already online, neighbors plotting next month's color with glee. I took a walk, soaking in the shift. Waves replaced curt nods. Thanks for toppling her came easy, a community stitched from her unraveling. Her curtains no longer twitched. Her beige fortress was someone else's now, the new owners oblivious to its history. Frank stopped me, grinning. She called me yesterday, raving about chaos and crime, hung up when I laughed. I shrugged. She's grasping. She's got nothing left. He nodded, and I kept walking, passing my old foe's curb where her control had died. The pink on my house didn't sting anymore. It was a battle scar, a reminder of what one stand could do. She'd ruled through fear, but fear only worked if we let it, and we'd stopped. Her threat texted in the dark was just noise. She'd lost power, respect, everything, and I'd turned her own game into her exit. The street hummed with life, no longer hers to dictate, and as I headed home, I left my coffee cup out a little longer, just because I could, and because she couldn't stop me. Karen's departure settled over the neighborhood like a long-overdue thaw, the air lighter without her shadow looming. Driveways stayed cluttered with bikes and chairs. Lawns sprouted quirky ornaments, and the rainbow stripes on her old house gleamed as a permanent taunt. The HOA, now a voluntary shell of her regime, shifted to practical fixes, potholes patched, trees planted, no more fines for mismatched mats or cracked concrete. Neighbors lingered outside, chatting freely, no longer dodging her clipboard or dreading her next decree. Her for sale sign was gone, new owners unpacking with no hint of the war that house once waged, and the street felt ours again, reclaimed from her beige tyranny. Monthly votes for her house's color became a ritual. Lime green next, someone pitched, and the laughter at each tally was a balm to years of her grip. I leaned into the change, leaving my pink house as is for now, a neon badge of the fight, not a burden. People waved as I passed, some still marveling at how I'd owned the HOA all along, others just glad to breathe without her rules choking them. "Thanks for taking her down," Mrs. Patel said one day, her once-fined hose now coiled proudly in view. I grinned. She did it to herself. It was true. Her paint stunt had lit the fuse, and I'd just fanned the flames. The community knit tighter, her downfall a glue we hadn't expected. Barbecues popped up, kids roamed, and that freedom felt like victory, not just over her, but for us. Her texted threat lingered in my mind. "I'll be back." But it was toothless, a ghost rattling chains she no longer held. One evening I sat on my porch, the pink glow softening in dusk, and Frank ambled over, beer in hand. "Heard she's selling that full-price deal to flip something else. Still thinks she's a queen somewhere." I laughed. "Let her try, she won't find this neighborhood again." He clinked his bottle to mine, to no more Karens. We drank, the stars sharp above, and I saw her house down the block, stripes blazing, a monument to her misstep. She built an empire on control, but one reckless move, painting my house, had toppled it, exposing her to a revolt she couldn't quell. The new owners waved from their porch, oblivious, and I waved back, the irony thick. Her fortress now just another home, her legacy a punchline. The next morning I walked past, spotting a kid's tricycle on their lawn, no fines, no fuss, and felt the shift complete. My pink walls didn't irk me anymore, they were proof of what we'd won, a street alive, not dictated. Karen had ruled through fear, finding welcome mats, cracking down on cracks, but fear only lasted until someone said no. I'd said it, and the rest followed, turning her own rules into her trap. Her final text was bravado, nothing more. She'd lost power, respect, the neighborhood, and that full-price escape was her white flag, not a comeback. I kicked back later, coffee in hand, watching dusk settle over a freer block. Dogs barked, kids laughed, no notices loomed. She painted my house to flex, but it had painted her out, and as the stars winked on, I knew this was ours now, messy and loud and perfect. The neighborhood's new rhythm held steady, a quiet chaos Karen would have despised, lawns dotted with flamingos and mismatched chairs, kids' chalk sprawling across sidewalks, the rainbow stripes on her old house now a local legend. The HOA faded to a whisper, its voluntary status stripping it of teeth. No more fees, no fines, just neighbors pitching in for what mattered, like a new park bench or a fixed curb. Her reign felt like a distant fever dream, her beige edicts replaced by a vibrancy she defined into oblivion. New owners settled into her place, their laughter spilling out as they hung a quirky wind chime, unapproved, unbothered, and I smirked knowing she'd hate it. Monthly votes kept her house a canvas. Lime green won next, glitter paint loomed, and each tally was a middle finger to her legacy, a ritual of defiance we'd earned. My pink house stood unchanged, a neon scar I'd grown fond of, a reminder of the spark that torched her rule. People nodded as I passed, some still chuckling about the HOA twist. You owned it all along. Others just glad to live without her shadow. Barbecues became tradition, grills firing up, stories of her absurdity swapped like war tailies. Mrs. Patel's hose, Frank's cracked driveway, my paint job the crown jewel. She thought she'd break you, Frank said one night, handing me a beer, but you broke her. I clinked his bottle. She broke herself, I just pushed. The truth hung there, her power trip had been her undoing, my stand the crack that split it wide. Her texted threat, I'll be back, was a ghost note empty without leverage, and I'd filed it away with a grin. Walking the block, I saw her old curb, now home to a kid's bike and a welcome match she'd have banned, freedom in the mundane. The pink glow of my walls caught the sun, and I didn't mind. It was ours, a trophy of a fight won not just for me, but for all of us. She painted it to flex, a petty jab, but it had unraveled her empire, her need to control tripping her into a fall she couldn't dodge. The new owners waved, oblivious to the history, and I waved back, the irony sharp. Her fortress a home again, her rules dust. Later, I sat on my porch, coffee steaming, watching dusk settle. Dogs yapped, a radio hummed, no clipboard loomed. She'd lost everything, power, respect, the neighborhood, and that full-price exit was her surrender, not a return ticket. As stars pricked the sky, my phone stayed silent. No more threats, just peace. Corinne was gone, her circus hers to run elsewhere, and we'd rebuilt on her ashes, messy, loud, alive. The pink stayed, a badge I'd keep for now, proof one push could topple a tyrant. Neighbors laughed down the street, planning next month's color, zebra stripes, and I raised my mug to it all. She'd ruled through fear, but fear crumbled when we laughed back, and we turned her paint into our victory. The stripes down the block glowed, a kid's chalk streaked my walk, and I left my cup out late, just because I could and she couldn't stop me. One house, one vote, one stand, and the queen was dethroned. Sometimes the smallest battles paint the biggest wins.